I'll be talking to you today about modeling the commercial feasibility of gas pipelines, expansion, and the subsequent impact on energy prices. As we all know, it's a PLEXOS user group conference, and it's just been electricity so far. So being the first developer for Energy Exemplar gas PLEXOS software, I feel pretty slighted, but I will let that pass for now. So yeah, a bit of a history with this work. This work literally came from the need to pretty much show the use of PLEXOS gas in a commercial environment. As we all know, what a lot of the ISOs use PLEXOS gas for is mainly for planning, so demand supply balancing and seeing if there's a risk for gas shortages and stuff. But the real issue the real insights we wanted to drive out of this work was if we had a chance to talk to a pure gas utility today, would they really care about demand supply alone? Probably not. They would want to see some commercial returns on their investments and how PLEXOS can help them as one tool in a set of toolboxes to sort of get what the future viability of the investments will be. So this work came from a master's project I supervised as an industrial supervisor, and we did that through the Melbourne Energy Institute in Melbourne. So I'll start by giving a brief introduction about Cornwall Insight. It's actually my first day with the company today. Yeah, I would try to remember as much as they told me on the phone yesterday. So after that, I'll go into the Australian gas market at the crossroads, so give you some insights about Australia and our gas markets, pretty interesting. Then talk about the importance of connectivity, how we model a network market, and the implications for the Australian energy market as a whole, and then some conclusions. But the key question we're trying to answer here is there a way that if you have an improved gas network, can that have an effect on gas prices? Is there any way we could literally reduce gas prices by better connecting your gas market? And the reason why this is such a big issue in Australia, which I will show you in a bit, is because before the LNG exports in Australia, our gas prices was at like $3 to $4, and now we're looking at $9 to $10 in gas prices. So there's been some talks about government intervention and government literally capping exports and stuff like that, or even bringing a reservation policy to tell the producers that you can't, for every gas molecule that comes out of the ground, in Australia you have to reserve a certain percentage for the market. That's not come through yet, but we said, is there a non-interventionist mechanism to reduce gas prices without necessarily having a sovereign investment risk issue? So a bit about Cornwall Insight. We were formed in 2005. We've been around for a bit now. One of the key things we do is research. So we sort of act like a think tank where we have a range of experts in the business, and some come from modeling background, some are policy experts, some are regulatory experts, and we come together and work on different projects. So if the project is one that requires heavy modeling, we get our modeling experts to work on it, and if it's a project that requires more like policy kind of regulatory framework, we have our guys work on that as well. And we are now in we were formerly only in Great Britain, but now we've expanded to Ireland and some parts of Europe as well, Scotland, and now we're in Australia. So we got a minority investment from BGF, which is a business growth fund. They're one of the largest private investors in Europe. And with that investment, we got a new board, and there's been a big drive for growth. So expansion naturally came with that, and Australia was one of the regions they came into. We're very trusted by our customers because we have a very insight-driven approach to work. So it's not just we do like a consulting work for you and deliver it to you. We present the facts to the client, and we leave that with the client to do what they want from that. So we sort of approach issues from let's sort of get the independent facts out there without necessarily knowing where it's leading us. And I think that was a big drive for me personally in joining. We have over 400 clients, from the big users to the entrepreneurial types. We have government bodies across Europe. We have some ISOs. We do sell insights as well, with subscription with them. And we also do ad hoc work, or sometimes it could just be like advice that we just dispense. So now to the actual work. So the Australian energy market, as you can see there, before the LNG export started, you can see that our demand was pretty flat, and when the LNG sort of came on board here, it literally tripled our demand in a very short time. And one of the things that came with that is that there. So as you can see, our gas prices were around the $3 to $5 mark. And when the export came on board, we literally just jumped like close to $10. And one of the really interesting things that came with that is because of the linkage now to the Asian LNG market, our gas prices has just started tracking the same LNG price since when the LNG came on. And you can see some sort of correlation there with a bit of lag. And that lag we're seeing there is the relationship between the Northern Asian peak demand and in LNG and the Australian winter peak demand in July. So usually there is a bit of like lag in the peak prices and when the prices jump as well. So the transformational shifts we've seen in demand meant that high prices and a risk of political intervention is now a thing in Australia. So a bit more about our resources. So as you can see here, this is a graph of our supply curve by quantity and price. So price is on your y-axis and the quantities on your x-axis. And the probable reserves developed are literally gas reserves that have been proven today. So there's been some exploration work done. We know the gas is there. There's been some capex in sort of getting the gas out, and that's the reserve you're seeing there. And the undeveloped are the reserves that we know they're there, and they've not been developed yet, so we haven't actually put equipment in the ground to bring those resources out. And for the contingent resources, they are the sort of gas molecules that could be there, but we can't say with a high degree of certainty that they're there. And if you look at this here, this is a very interesting one where this is a proven reserve, but it's undeveloped, but the cost curve is actually higher than some contingent resources. And this gas field here is one of the sort of fields I'm going to be talking about in this talk today. If you also look at this curve here, we are fast running out of these gas resources. So the days of cheap gas in Australia is pretty much over, not just from an LNG-driven price hike, also the actual getting the gas out of the ground now, you need more stronger equipment, more tech equipment, and the cost of getting that gas out of the ground is pretty much between your $6 to $8 mark in the very, very near future. And I think there are some fields in Australia today that are already producing at those prices. So what's the benefits of an interconnected market? Why do we want an interconnected market at all? So we sort of just put the map of the US pipeline network against the Australian pipeline network. And as you can see, this here literally looks like some Brownian motion happening, but those are all pipelines. It's a very, very well-connected market. Henry Hub is probably the most liquid gas market in the world, gas hub in the world. And in Australia, our market is not as interconnected. And since the LNG came on, you can see that the actual the illiquid nature of our market is actually coming out now. In US, you have a sort of gas price range now of like $3 to $4, and in Australia, you have about 9 to 10. So the question we're trying to ask is this due to connectivity alone, or does connectivity have a role to play in this? Okay, I'll also talk a bit more about the actual geography of our market. So in Australia, we do have the short-term trading market in gas, and that's looking at the East Coast market alone. So that's your Sydney, Adelaide, Tasmania, Melbourne, and Brisbane, Queensland. But the actual Melbourne gas node is it settles on a slightly different commercial term. I would not go into too much detail, but the eastern market is literally there. The northern gas market, up until very recently, was not connected to the east, and the Western Australian market is completely separated from the rest of the country. But the Western Australian gas market has a gas reservation policy in place. That's because they have a very mature LNG industry. So the LNG industry has been there for quite a while. And when that industry started really booming, the government said for every molecule or for every production profile for the producers, they have to reserve a certain percentage for the local market. We don't have that in the East Coast, and our LNG export is somewhere there in Queensland, in the East Coast, and that's one of the key reasons why obviously our gas prices is gone up. So in this particular piece of work, what we did was we said, if we look at some transmission projects, what would the impact of those projects be on gas prices? So the first project we looked at was the Queensland Hunter Gas Project. We call that, for the purposes of this paper, the WMP. And what that project there is doing is linking the sort of the LNG producing region there to the East Coast. So it's literally going through it's going through a region called the Narrabri-Gunnedah Basin into Newcastle, then into Sydney. So currently, to get gas into Sydney, you need to go from Queensland somewhere to South Australia, then into Sydney. But what this particular proposed project we're looking at is doing is bypassing the need to go through South Australia and just connecting Queensland straight into Sydney. So that's the first one there. The second one we looked at was the Northern Territory. So this territory here has very low demand. The demand is not high at all, but they're very gas rich. So what we said was, what would the impact on prices be if we examined a project that's linking this gas-rich region into Queensland, into the east coast of Australia? And the third project we looked at was literally an import terminal, so a floating regasification unit. And we're saying if we stick that unit there in Melbourne, Melbourne being a very rich gas-producing area as well, although the fields are also depleting quite fast, we also wanted to see what that there would do to gas prices. So, but the challenge here, as we know, is the sort of historical use of PLEXOS in the gas world is for supply planning. So literally you're just planning getting gas from the producers to the end user. The ISOs don't really look at prices or the commercial viability of this project. So the challenge we had in this particular piece of work was, how do we change a supply planning model into a pricing model? So one of the things we looked at there was, we said the first thing we want to do is we want to get prices and output. So we want to be able to configure this supply model to producing reasonable and good realistic prices. And the second thing we wanted to do was we wanted to link the international LNG market into Australia. So by doing that, we just wanted to say, well, if you have this sort of LNG import terminal, for instance, how would that work in your market? So we wanted to sort of say, if you have a forward curve of the LNG price, you want that to come straight into your market. Then the second thing also we did was the LNG netback pricing. So for the gas exporters, we wanted the price at which they were exporting to be like an opportunity cost for, you could either export, or if the local demand can pay the export price, they get that gas. And the other thing we looked at here was modeling LNG contracts. Traditionally, we've always looked at LNG contract as a flat, static number. But what we did here was we said, well, we do know that producers do not, they do not have a flat profile for LNG exports. They do have a contracted volume, and beyond that contracted volume, there's a spot volume on there. So there's a bit of flex in the contract, and what we did was we said, let's break this rule of a static profile and only make sure that they can meet their contractual obligations. And beyond that, we leave that to an optimization. So if the market dynamics is good enough, fine, export it. Otherwise, if there's going to be a shortage in the local gas market, we want that gas to come into Australia. And the really interesting thing with this was that right about the time when we were talking about this, the Australian government came up with a heads of agreement where they met the gas producers and they said, well, if AEMO forecasts through their gas planning report that next year is going to be a shortage year, the LNG producers have to divert some of their gas into the local market. So we sort of incorporated that dynamic into this model. And the final thing we did was we said that, well, we can't just look at gas on its own. If there is going to be a potential for price reductions in gas, we want to see how that flows through into electricity prices, because we do know that there are gas plants in Australia that do set the price at different times of the year. So if you have a reduced gas price, how does that affect the final electricity price, electricity wholesale price? So moving on. The scenarios we looked at was the base case. That was like a do-nothing case. If no projects, if everything was the way it was today, what would the prices look like? The second scenario we looked at was the base case with the option to build the Northern Gas Pipeline. And the third scenario we looked at was with the base case with the Hunter Gas Pipeline bringing the gas into Sydney. And the final one was the base case with the floating storage. Then the last one we looked at, which is probably my favorite here, is saying, well, if you have these two pipeline projects coming, what would be the impact? Are they going to like take out some revenue from each other? Is there going to be a competition effect where they both, the impact, the sort of revenue from both will be less than if one was built? So we sort of looked at that as well. And the outputs we looked at was the price impact, the system benefits, which is like if you're an ISO, you care more about the market benefits. You don't really care about the return for the investor. But the third scenario we also looked at was if you're an investor, what would your cash flows look like with these projects coming on? And the last one we looked at was the analysis on the impact on electricity prices. So, yes, so we can see here that when we took the system costs with this project on, for the different graphs there, you can see the different pricing impact. So the line at the top there is the base case, where we sort of have, you know, your long-term average prices of like $9 to $10, like what we have today. But when these projects actually came on, the Northern Gas Pipeline project that's bringing the gas from the gas-rich north into the East Coast, we see that there is some price reduction in the short term at least, not so much in the long term. And with the Hunter Gas Pipeline, you can see that there's a sustained price reduction across the whole horizon. So we ran this model for about 10 years, so sort of reflecting a realistic commercial outlook for a gas utility. And the last scenario we sort of looked at was this, where you have both the Hunter Gas Pipeline coming on and the Northern Gas Pipeline coming on, and you can see that provided the sort of highest benefits for the Adelaide node. And for Brisbane, the difference wasn't that much, and that's because that is the LNG exporting region. So your marginal price is almost at its highest, so the interconnectivity you get in doesn't really help much there, because if you have cheaper gas coming from somewhere, by the time you pay the pipeline cost to get it there, you might as well be getting the gas from the producers there. But in Melbourne, you can see as well that we have price reductions to varying degrees, and same as Sydney. Sydney is a very interesting one because Sydney does import about 96% of its gas. Sydney doesn't have a heavy gas production facility. And we can see that with the pipeline project actually coming on in Sydney, especially for both cases where you have the two pipelines, there is a sustained price reduction. The really interesting one was the floating regasification and storage unit. It did not seem to have any price reduction effect at all. So if you sort of stick an import terminal in there and you're importing gas from overseas at like $10, you might as well be producing it in Australia, because it's the prices are literally the same. without the capex of your floating regasification unit. But we sort of looked at the system and investor impact. So for the system impact, what we did here was we said to calculate this, we looked at the price reduction. So if you have in the base case, if you have a $10 per gigajoule gas price, and with the introduction of interconnection, you have a $2 reduction. We're saying if you take that $2 reduction and you multiply it by the system demand, that gives you what we call the sort of total system benefits. That's like the cost savings to the end user in the price of gas. And you can see from here that with the Hunter gas pipeline, that gave us the sort of highest system benefits from a system point of view. And with the NGP, which is the Northern gas pipeline, the system benefits are there, but not that much. And there's a big reason for this. The reason for this is that even though the pipeline is connected to a really gas-rich region, it's constrained in capacity. So the capacity of that pipeline that we put in the model was about 90 terajoules per day. So if you have a lot of gas in the ground, you still can only take in 90 terajoules a day. So the benefits to the end user there is quite limited. And if we ran a sensitivity of this with an increased capacity, and the system benefits was much higher. And when you combine both, you see there that you actually have a higher system benefit. And the really interesting thing here is that you have by having both pipelines together in the same system, the system benefit is actually higher than the independent system benefit if you add them one after the other. So the whole is sort of greater than the sum of the parts. And for the investor benefit, we do know that system benefit is not enough for an investor to put money on a project. So no investor is going to put money on a project that they're going to be losing money, even though the end user gets reduced gas prices. So we sort of said, well, if we look at the flows across those pipelines that we've looked at, times the tariffs of those pipelines, what would the return on the investment be for the investor? And the really interesting thing here is that for the QHEP, which is the Queensland Hunter Gas Pipeline, that did seem to give us the highest system benefit. But this project is quite interesting because in Australia, when they talk about this project, they talk about it from the perspective of connecting the project to the gas field I was showing you earlier that had the really high cost. So when they talk about that project, they're talking about connecting it to this gas field. But what we saw was even when we turned this gas field on in the model, there was very, very little flow coming out of the gas field. So it means the benefits we get from that project is purely from interconnection, not from getting access to more gas. And that was really interesting because what the model was telling us is you can get cheaper gas elsewhere, but the benefit you're going to get out of this is by being able to move your gas to a high demand region without going through another region, which we found that pretty interesting insight. And for the Northern gas pipeline, what we saw there was that we have the sort of this sort of investor benefits of literally half the build cost. So the build cost is the blue line here, and you can see here that there's sort of a gap there. But like I said earlier, that is due to the limited capacity we assumed in the model. And one thing that we really saw that was really interesting here was that when you actually look at the investor benefit for both being there, the Northern gas pipeline actually loses. So there's a competition, there's sort of like a competition effect to having both pipelines there. And this Queensland Hunter gas pipeline did seem to benefit more from having both projects in there than the Northern gas pipeline. For the floating regasification storage unit, we didn't really see much there because, like I said, you're better off literally using the gas you're producing in the country at the same price than building a import terminal to sort of bring gas in. But I would put a bit of a caveat on that in the sense that we did not incorporate all the LNG market dynamics. So there was no variability in oil prices. There was no boil-off rate or anything like that. We just literally stuck a storage into the model, put the injection in the storage as 0. It's an infinite storage, and the withdrawal cost from that storage was your sort of long-term LNG forward curve. Finally, we looked at the potential impact on electricity prices here. And what we did here was that we took the price setter data, where we looked at the periods in the year where gas actually set the price in the electricity market. So we did that for a year. And we said, if we prorata this cost savings from gas into the fuel cost of these generators, what would that do to the final price of electricity? And what we see here was, with the NGP scenario, we got a 1% reduction in New South Wales, but the biggest reduction was when we had both pipelines in there. Again, this does show that interconnectivity and the ability to move gas from the sort of cheapest resource to where it's needed the most does provide, or can provide, benefits to the electricity market as well. Then the second scenario we looked at was, well, if these gas generators sort of have a reduction in price, and if that reduction now forces the coal generators to rebid based on gas generators having lower prices, what would that do to the final electricity price as well? So we sort of had a situation where gas is now cheaper, and in some periods of the year, the coal generators might have to change their bids into cheaper bids as well to be in the money. What would that do to the final price of electricity? And we see here that we can get up to about 22% reduction in some regions in the final electricity price. The analysis done here was very, very ad hoc and very rough, mainly because, as we know, gas and electricity have a very dynamic interaction. It's not, you can't take a static number, prorata it, and think that's your final answer. But the reason why we did this here was for the next research piece we're going to look at. And the next research piece we're going to look at was a co-optimization model of your gas and electricity. But this was more like a teaser to sort of give us the motivation to pursue the second piece, where you have a gas network co-optimizing an electricity network and seeing how those interactions affect the final electricity price. For those who are interested, we are currently looking sort of, and by we I mean like from a research perspective, we are looking at some dynamic modeling for gas and electricity interactions for the East Coast market, and we're really keen to sort of learn about some of the European models as well, because we do know that there's some research groups here that have looked at this, especially from, I was talking to Paul earlier about some risk from Russian gas coming into Europe, and we sort of want to be able to bring in some of the knowledge you have here into this co-optimization model we're looking at doing. And also we want to look at like an additional storage and interconnection. So if you have like high levels of penetration of batteries, what would that do to gas usage for GPG generators? And we can capture that as well in a co-optimization model. And the other thing is looking at the impact of uncertainty from variable renewable energy. The publication is here if you're interested. It's been peer reviewed and it's been published in Energy. And yeah, if you, I think there's a copy as well on the Energy Exemplar website if you are interested. Thank you. Questions?